to kick us off with the questions, please, Gary?
Well, please introduce yourself, Heather.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here, excited to be with you guys. I think this is one of the fun side effects, I guess, of our current situation is that we're all experimenting with what we can do with virtual events. And it means that you guys can be in the UK and I can be in the US and we can all still be having a conversation and doing the virtual version of an event together. I guess if I were to introduce myself, I would say I am a scientist turned storyteller. I started my career getting a PhD in biology, in marine biology, and along the way realized that the lab, and for that matter, even in the field, doing the experiments wasn't really where I was meant to be. What I really loved was the stories inside and around science. And so I kind of jumped tracks and I spent 12 years as a journalist, interviewing hundreds of scientists and helping them tell their stories. And then recently made another shift to work with Woods Hole Research Center in a communications role there because quite frankly, I had done plenty of reporting on climate change, but was really just feeling like I needed to be giving 100% of my professional effort to telling stories that could actually drive change, the change that we really need to address the climate crisis.
Well, I hope that we do you justice. You're a great interviewer. I was listening to your podcast, 800 interviews with brilliant minds.
A lot of things that I've gotten to learn, a lot of interesting people that I got to interview over the years during my journalism career, and you know, doing something a little bit different now with Woods Hole Research Center, but now surrounded by several dozen really interesting and really intelligent climate scientists who are completely dedicated to understanding the world's climate system and not just doing that science, but both doing that science with an eye toward possible solutions and then making sure that that information gets to the people who can use it to make the change we need.
So I've got a question for you, Heather, on that. What I've read is that for the last 4 years, the Woods Hole Research Centre has been named as the top climate change research centre in the world. So amongst all these wonderful minds, I'd be really interested to hear what for you is one of the top 1 or 2 things, top 1 or 2 insights that you like, that you've found since you joined the centre.
Right. Yeah, you're referring to the fact that we've been rated the #1 climate change think tank, I think 4 years in a row, as you said, which is an interesting, you know, it's a wonderful honor, kind of interesting because I think one of the things that drew me to Woods Hole Research Center is the fact that there's no one descriptor that really encompasses what we do. Think tank probably doesn't quite encapsulate it. It's that combination, as I said, of research and trying to put that into action through talking with policymakers, talking with the public, working with partners. And I think some of our work with partners is some of the most innovative and interesting work that we do, where whether it's looking at the ability of agricultural soils to absorb carbon, or our work in the Amazon or the Congo with forests, or for that matter, some of our newer work looking at the physical risks of climate change, what it will actually look like in 2030, 2040, 2050 in terms of temperatures or precipitation, and what that translates to in terms of our ability to work or to move around, what that means for our economy. All of this is work that's coming out of really close partnerships and kind of outside the box partnerships where it's not just collaborating with academic colleagues or other colleagues at nonprofits, but working with members of the private sector and in some cases, major influencers in the private sector. Earlier this year, back in January, McKinsey and Company, largest consulting company in the world, released a report that Woods Hole Research Center contributed the analysis of physical climate risk for their analysis of the economic and socioeconomic risks, again, in the near term, in this kind of 2030 to 2050 realm, not looking decades and decades out, but something that a lot of us will see in our lifetime. And so I think that kind of work is really, really important. But then on the other, I don't know if it's end of the spectrum, we've also got really exciting work, really deeply embedded in the natural world and looking at the potential for natural climate solutions and also some of the risks of emissions from natural ecosystems as we warm the planet and ecosystems change. places that have been sinks of carbon, that have been sucking up carbon and storing it in the past, whether that's forests or the permafrost in the Arctic, some of those are shifting. We're reaching tipping points where they're now becoming sources of carbon to the atmosphere. And so we're really looking at those systems to try to figure out where are the potential solutions and where are some of the risks.
I think the one I'm particularly interested in really is this permafrost one, because I've known for some years now that there is a tipping point, there is a risk around the permafrost. So as I understand it, this is one of those things where, you know, you read about a tipping point, and we're so used to the Hollywood version of life where at the last minute someone comes in and saves the situation, it's all okay. But with this permafrost tipping point, as I understand it, and it'd be good if you can clarify this to try and put this into human terms for people. But as I understand it, once this really kicks off, then the thing becomes unstoppable, because the methane going into the air increases the temperature of the world, which increases the risk of the permafrost melting. And basically this is something which has, as I understand it, really has no solution. There's nothing that can come in and stop this. But anyway, you're the expert. You correct me on this one.
Right. So I don't know that it's so much of a correction or refinement. Let's take a step back to the beginning of the process. So permafrost, kind of short for permanently frozen ground in the Arctic, which unfortunately I've now heard people making kind of dark jokes about, you know, it's then a frost or sometimes a frost. It's not really permanent anymore. What has happened is that that ground, which is incredibly rich in carbon, right? It's ground that is peat from marshes and trees that has been turned into soil, and that carbon has been locked there frozen for thousands of years. And as the planet is warming, and the Arctic is warming faster than most of the rest of the planet, which is a different set or a related set of processes we can talk about, but as it's rapidly warming, that permafrost is starting to thaw. And as it does that, it can release greenhouse gases. You mentioned methane, also potentially carbon dioxide. And the threat there is that permafrost holds more carbon than is already in the atmosphere, right? And what you were referring to is this feedback loop. As we warm, it thaws more, there's more release of greenhouse gases, which causes more warming, which causes more melting, and you just end up in this vicious cycle. And I wouldn't say that there's no solution, but there's certainly no switch that we can flip that will just turn that off. The solution is that we have to decrease global carbon emissions to limit that warming and slow down the whole global process. So there's no switch we can flip, but what this really highlights, and maybe I'll introduce the coronavirus parallel theme here for the day with this, right, is that we have the science to see what is coming, and we can project what is likely to happen in the future and what those risks are. And we need to act on those projections now, because once that starts to happen, it's too late. It's very much like the coronavirus outbreak, that once you've got coronavirus, as we're now unfortunately all familiar with, once you've got it spreading in a community, it's really hard to put that back in the box, right? You have to act before that when there are projections that you could start to see infections in your community. And that can be a really hard thing to do, right? To say, well, everything's fine now, but it's going to get really bad, so I need to take really dramatic action now. Why can't I wait till it gets bad? And I think what we're learning, hopefully, from this pandemic is that no, when we get these kinds of warnings from scientists that this is what is likely to happen down the road, we need to actually be heeding those warnings and acting early.
I think scientists will be taken a little bit more seriously. The politicians tend to just say, brush over the detail, 5 or 10% either way. This is quite a shock, I think, to a lot of politicians. Heather, can I ask you, you're such a calm, wonderful person. What got you into science and your love for the environment?
I would have to trace that back to being 12 years old, and there must have been some underlying interest, because I went to a 3-week summer camp run by a fabulous group called the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, a nonprofit, and they took a dozen 12 and 13-year-olds on a small working boat, basically camping our way all the way from the headwaters of the Chesapeake Bay down to the mouth of the bay, camping along the way, doing water quality testing, I encountered my first composting toilet on that trip. Got to learn about the crabbing industry and about the threats to the oyster industry and the declining populations of both crabs and oysters in the bay. And I came back from that 3-week summer camp experience just completely inspired, and looked at my mom as a 12-year-old and just said, the oceans are in trouble. I have to save the oceans. Now, obviously, fast forward 30 years, and there have been twists and turns. That love of the ocean remains. I live about 2 miles from the ocean and can't imagine moving away from the ocean, even though that's not what I'm doing on a daily basis right now, studying the ocean or reporting on the ocean all of the time. But that's really what got me started. And I should say, that's what really sustained me through graduate school, although I was definitely interested in the environment. I wasn't doing anything related to climate change at that point. My awareness of climate change and real interest, professional interest in the climate change issue happened very early in my journalism stint, talking to some fisheries biologists here in Woods Hole and asking them, okay, what are we going to see in terms of impacts on our fisheries here in New England? I mean, New England, I live on Cape Cod, right? Named for cod, named for fisheries. What's going to happen? And what they told me just completely took me by surprise, which it took me by surprise on 2 levels. What they told me was that half of all commercially fished species had already significantly shifted where they're found in the ocean as a result of changing water temperatures, and that was just going to continue, and that we were also likely to see declines in total harvests. And I looked at them and I said, you mean this is already happening? And this was in 2009. And they said, yes. And so I was shocked just on one level that, oh, this is already happening. It's not in the future. I had kind of gotten the message that this was in the future. And then I had a deeper level of shock and surprise, which was, I'm a scientist living in Woods Hole, which is this crazy community with 6 different research organizations in this one tiny village, immersed in science. How could I not know? And if I didn't know, that meant that so many other people definitely didn't know. And that's what really, I think, launched my passion for talking about
I
climate.
think you have a gift for communication. I've only known you a few days, really, and it's your non-science talking. I think because we have a science community, and if you go out of that community, I think you can be you're very relatable. So what kind, if you could plan out the next 4 or 5 years, what would be your aim for you to communicate to the public, the non-scientific community?
Well, that's a really big question. And I think, though, the answer is pretty simple and universal. And really what we need, and we don't even have 5 years to wait for this, what we need is for everyone to realize that while doing more science is absolutely critical for refining our understanding and figuring out which solutions will be best and where the greatest risks are and how great the threats are, the basic science that we need to drive action and to justify action, we already have that. We already know that climate change is happening. We already know that it's caused by human action, by the burning of fossil fuels. We already know that it causes and is causing and will continue to cause deaths and economic harm and hardship. And we already have technologies and strategies that we can deploy to start combating it. And so that's what I really, it doesn't take a PhD to know those things and to understand that. That is the basics of what the science, decades of science at this point, boils down to, is we know we have this problem that we need to be addressing earlier rather than later, and we do have tools to do that.
That was so beautifully put. Dare I say, I know Charles has got lots of questions too, but that word tipping point, that's the word that people are in denial about, because they'll be like, oh, we'll figure it out. But there is a tipping point, and we can't, how accurate can we make our prediction to where the tipping point is?
Yeah, well, and that's definitely, I think, where the cutting edge of a lot of the science is right now, that we know there are tipping points, there will be tipping points. Exactly when we reach those is less certain. And in part, it's less certain because what scientists can't predict and model for is what we do, right? So scientists run these different climate models with different assumptions about how much greenhouse gases we actually put into the atmosphere, what our behavior is like. But until we actually know what that behavior is, we can't precisely predict when we will reach the tipping points. It depends on our human actions. And again, that's another parallel to the coronavirus outbreak, right? We can look at these predictions of how much will we flatten the curve and when will we reach the peak and when will it subside. And we can model that with a bunch of different assumptions, but in the end, the actual answer can't be known until we actually know, did we have 100% social distancing? Of course, we're never going to have perfect 100% quarantine and social distancing, but did we have 85% efficient or 50% efficient or only 25% efficient distancing? And that completely changes when you hit those tipping points.
So Gary, there's a big comparison that I'd like to make, which is that in a number of countries now and in a number of cities across the world, a climate and environmental emergency has been declared. So in the UK, we've got a climate and environmental emergency. Heather, in parts of the US, I think you have in New York, you have in California, and you have in some other places as well. But what does that mean, particularly in the UK? I mean, in the UK now, we've got this, we've had delivered by post, we've had this wonderful leaflet, came in just a couple of weeks ago. Coronavirus, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. Now, have we had this for climate change? We've had an emergency here since June. We've got within the UK, we've got hundreds, 200, 250 out of maybe 500 local authorities have declared an emergency. But have we had this type of leaflet and simple actions from any of these? And I think it comes down to the basics. I mean, Heather eloquently outlined the fact that the science says there is a problem, it's happening now, and there will be a problem, be a bigger problem. So the science is very clear, but it's the politicians who haven't leapt onto this. And so, it's turned out there are these communities. We had scientific committees. We have this wonderful committee in the UK called the Science and something expert committee. So this expert committee is looking at coronavirus, but I'm not aware that the committee's looked at climate change, but actually does it need to? Because the UN and the IPCC have been studying this for years. So as Heather says, it's actually very straightforward. So for me, it comes down to what are the politicians going to do about this following coronavirus, and basically what can each of us do? Each of us as citizens of the world do to get our local politician to join in and do something. This is it's a fundamental question, and for me it comes down to, look, what do we want? If we as individuals, and enough of us, say we want action on this, then it will, without a doubt, it will happen. But if people keep sitting back and saying, okay, well, it seems to be okay, I'll just carry on, I'll carry on doing what I'm doing, then we're never going to get there. So Gary, back over to you.
Yeah, big points there. You've written so many.
I would love to respond to that a little bit. I mean, I think
please.
A few thoughts occurred as you were saying that, Charles, and the first is that here in the US, we've seen an interesting parallel. I don't know that it's an absolute ironclad correlation in a scientific sense, but some have noted that the governors, the state leaders who are putting forth some of the strongest climate change policies were also some of the ones who put forth the earliest and strongest responses to the coronavirus outbreak. And to me, that is a symbol of, or a reflection of those who are, as we were talking about earlier, heeding the scientific advice that they're getting and willing to take action based on those projections, not waiting to see the worst happen before you actually act. And to your point about, will politicians take the lesson or lessons of COVID-19 and move forward with more appropriate action for an emergency, for a climate emergency? I think it needs to not only be politicians, but all of us learning that lesson, because typically, and we know this from public opinion polling as well, that even those who are most concerned about climate change, many of them still tend to think of it as a distant problem, that it will affect someone else, somewhere else, some other time in the future, not that it's going to, or that it is affecting themselves, their families, and their communities right now. I think that's changing. We've been throwing around this term tipping point, and there are tipping points in natural systems. There are also definitely social tipping points. And I think there's been a lot of discussion over the past few years of, are we hitting a tipping point? Extreme weather has become so extreme and so in our faces that we're seeing people start to connect the dots, because they are seeing climate impacts in their backyards, in their communities, and starting to realize, oh, this is affecting me. But we still have this lag time, that even when we're declaring climate emergencies, we're not acting like it's an emergency today or next week. We're still acting like it's an emergency next year. And maybe if we could see a silver lining in this pandemic, it would be a really widespread and collective realization of our vulnerability, right? That unimaginably bad things can happen. Just because they haven't happened before doesn't mean that they will not happen.
In the business world, they talk about 80% of the time should be the solution, and 20% of the time should be how you solve the problem. So 80% the solution, 20% talking about the problem. So what are some of the solutions, and has coronavirus been a game changer for the environment? Because I certainly speak to people who didn't care, and then now they're saying, look, you see, the earth is fighting back. And yeah, that's not very scientific, but I'll take that as a start, like, that's great. The London air is the cleanest it's been for 70 years. Maybe people will get a taste for this. So what are some of the solutions that we can kick into?
Yeah, well, so I mean, on that coronavirus theme, and could this be a tipping point and a game changer? I think it has the potential to be a game changer in multiple different ways, both good and bad. People are seeing that when we stop economic activity, we start seeing sometimes wildlife in the streets, or we have cleaner air quality. So being able to make the connection between, the actions that we take on a daily basis really impact our environment in a really powerful way, and seeing that in a short-term way. Now, that doesn't mean that a 6-month or even a year slowdown in emissions is going to solve the climate crisis by any means, but it's an awareness tool, perhaps. I think that's the silver lining, is recognizing that we do have, not only that we're vulnerable, but the flip side of that we do have this power, that we have taken what several weeks ago would, in countries like the UK and the US, have been unimaginable actions to address this crisis. And not that it's obviously without pain and hardship for many, many people. We don't want to say that an economic shutdown is what we want to do for climate change. It's absolutely not. In fact, that poses threats to climate action in and of itself, but we're seeing that we have the power to do things that we didn't necessarily think we were capable or willing to do. And so maybe we can take out of that a sense of empowerment that we could transfer to working on climate change. And that in and of itself, I think, is as necessary and important a tool as wind turbines and solar panels, right? You've already alluded to this, Charles. It's political will is one of the biggest things that has been holding back the pace of climate action. And so if this can help create that sense of empowerment and will, then that is definitely a silver lining, at least.
I think both of them are very important, Heather. I mean, we've lived in this golden age where this is maybe the first time that since World War II, where basically people are facing this sort of crisis. I mean, in London in World War II, people would go to bed and they may be blown up in their beds. And with coronavirus, you hear these stories of people who today are fine, and then just within 7 or 8 days, they've actually gone through the full cycle and they're dead. as a result of coronavirus. So the vulnerability, I think, is very important to people who've had this invulnerable, this sort of James Bond syndrome where, people are always shooting at him, but he doesn't actually get shot. We've got this invulnerability which has been broken by what's happened here with coronavirus. And secondly, the speed of response. I mean, in the UK here, basically within a space of 3 days, about a third of the economy was shut down. So the data in the paper this morning is that 75% of people are actually now at home, not working, doing anything. And a third of the economy or more is just stopped. Now, as you say, for climate change, we do not want this. This is not what the solution to climate change is about. People were afraid. I think people were very afraid of what, if they agreed with climate change, they'd be very afraid of what this meant in terms of for them and the economy and everything. But let's be clear, even at the moment, we're requiring a high rate of reduction of CO2 emissions. We're talking about reducing CO2 emissions by 8% a year, I think is the target figure. So that means, what's that mean? It means shutting down 8% of the fossil fuel parts of the economy, which is only a part of the economy, per year. And that's a tiny amount compared with shutting down a third of the whole economy and 75% of people being at home. It's minor. And so that, I think, gives people a sense of, well, what can be done if we decided we need to do it. And the third point, which we've implicitly covered, is really listening to scientists, and instead of saying, "Oh well, thank you very much, now go back in your box," let's actually take note of what you're saying. And of course, that's another point with the coronavirus, which is that what's come out is that scientists have been talking in theory about the almost certainty of there being a pandemic of some sort, because that's the way things are. There's almost certainty of being a pandemic. When there is, because of the nature of air travel, it will go all over the world. And some of those pre-preparedness of plans clearly were not put in place. So that in the UK we're struggling with personal protection equipment, which is a basic of the reality of dealing with a lot of people who are incredibly ill in a way that we've never seen people this ill before, because never before have the health professionals been exposed to catching the disease from the patients at such a high level in the UK.
And Charles, we really should talk about one of the solutions that you're very passionate about, planting 1 billion trees.
1 trillion trees, please, Gary.
Trillion.
Yeah.
This is something of I'm not sure, Heather, you saw that internet sensation where a YouTuber said he'll plant 3 trees for £5. Were you around with that? Now, when Charles got hold of that information, he said, "Well, that's inflated price. I can do that far cheaper." Charles, tell us about how we can, with very little money, plant lots of trees and still save a family and a family's income. That's something we could really do.
Yeah, I mean, let's come back to a question to Heather about Woods Hole after this. But yeah, I mean, basically at noco2.org, we plant trees. So basically, we take your donation, we plant trees, we plant a lot of trees, and if you plant enough trees, then you will go carbon neutral. So the idea is, instead of planting just a few trees, we plant trees absolutely in bulk, and these trees are planted in Madagascar and Indonesia, and it's not expensive. So that's the fundamentals of it. And what's really important is we've got the circular economy coming in here, where for every 100 trees planted, it creates a day's work for people who are in extreme poverty. And because the trees are being planted in perpetuity, then it's creating an environment for wildlife, for birds and animals to live in as well. But I have to say here that one of the things that really it inspired me about this vision was the work of Woods Hole Research, because I think it was through one of the notes in the IPC paper annexes that I came across Woods Hole Research Centre and your 2016 paper, which is, to my mind, so important here, because it basically says that there are 500,000 hectares of land worldwide which are available, which have been deforested and could be replanted. And that if they were replanted, then that amount of land would basically remove 10% of CO2 emissions by the world every year that the trees are growing. So if the trees are growing for 25 years, then it's 10% of world emissions for 25 years or 30 years, or however long the trees are growing for. So, you know, it's one-off. I mean, once the trees have reached steady state, then they keep growing, but they're not absorbing additional CO2 emissions. But for me, that was such an important paper. So, I mean, Heather, I'm really interested in where you are now with this. That paper was a few years ago. So where are you? Any updates on that? How are these numbers changing?
Absolutely. The numbers are changing. Our understanding is changing all of the time. And I think a couple of really important numbers to call out in what you were saying and points to make. I mean, since that paper and that work you were talking about from 2015, 2016, we have seen an explosion of interest. And I think really particularly in recent months here in the US, we've seen an explosion of interest in this idea of planting trees as a climate solution. And I think, you know, as researchers, one thing that our scientists at Woods Hole Research Center are always trying to do is look really realistically, objectively, and factually at the claims and objectives of these different types of programs. And I think along those lines, calling out what you were saying, you know, that replanting, the work from 2015 saying, okay, there's this area that if we were to reforest it could absorb 10%. 10%. Now, that's important, but it also leaves another 90% of the work to do. And I think there has been, in the enthusiasm to adopt this solution, there's sometimes a big picture that is missed, and there's the thought that, oh, we can plant our way out of this. All we have to do is plant trees. And I think what we have to recognize about tree planting is that while it is absolutely essential, what our science at Woods Hole Research Center shows us is that there really isn't a solution to climate change without forests, but that they are not in any way wholly adequate on their own. We have to be cutting fossil fuel emissions. Forests, no matter how much planting we do, cannot keep up with you know, continually and unlimitedly expanding greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really important, but it's not the whole solution. And I think the other thing that often gets lost in this conversation is that planting trees where we have lost forest or where we have unused cropland, that sort of thing is important. But what is at least as important is preserving the forests that we still have standing. Because in fact, those are already absorbing carbon now. You know, when you plant new trees, you've got to wait decades for those trees to catch up to the rate and the amount of carbon absorption that standing forests are already doing. And those standing forests are also, as you mentioned, they're ecosystems. They are habitat for other plants and animals. They are regulating the flow of water through the landscape. They are performing all sorts of other functions that newly planted trees don't, because they're not a mature ecosystem yet. And so those standing forests are a climate solution right now, and preserving them is really, really important. So we can't think about planting trees to the expense of ignoring our deforestation problems. We have to really be cutting back on deforestation and then thinking about planting those trees as well.
The way I see it, though, Heather, is that they're very different. They're very different skill sets. And the people who are planting trees, you know, we all read the same UNFCCC and IPCC reports, but what's required for each is massively different. So, you know, I've built up some understanding of the tree planting side of it. I find the deforestation, the stopping deforestation, I find that's incredibly frustrating and incredibly confusing, because, you know, there's people out there, there's individuals out there who are collectively going out and saying, right, well, we want to, you know, economically we're in a bad situation, so therefore we want to take over some rainforest and plant something and grow stuff here. So you've got people like that. But then also I think you've got the agroforestry, the agro in the massive industrial agriculture companies who are going in on and doing this on an industrial scale. So there's some very complicated things in there in terms of the solutions. So do you have any sort of easy to understand insights into, you know, what we should be doing to stop this deforestation, which is just so frustrating?
Right. I mean, I can't claim to have an easy solution for deforestation. If I did, I would probably be doing something very different right now. But two things on that point. I think, first of all, yes, there are choices that we as individuals, as consumers, can make every day in terms of what we purchase, and understanding that what we purchase drives demand for things like the crops that are grown, or the beef that is grown. So if we talk about the Amazon and what is driving deforestation, it's largely beef production and soy production. So thinking about your choices, we also know that eating red meat has one of the highest carbon footprint of any food. So perhaps that means on an individual level, choosing to forego red meat once a week, or cutting back in some way on your red meat consumption, right? So there are individual choices that we can make, but I think to your point, absolutely, there are many parts of the climate crisis that will not be addressed simply by individual action. We are going to need large collective action. We're going to need state, federal, and international policy and coordination to address this. So there are, in that regard, I guess the individual action is to be pressing your elected officials on these issues and pushing them to engage in those sorts of policies. I would also say that in terms of solutions for some of these thorny problems around deforestation, I mean, that's something that our scientists at Woods Hole Research Center are also working on. And one really interesting study that came out just a couple of months ago highlighted the fact that deforestation policy or forest protection policy really intersects, as you've kind of alluded to, Charles, with issues of social justice. And then in particular in the Amazon, while lands that are held by indigenous groups there do see some carbon emissions, it tends to be from illegal activity, and that in fact the emissions from land held by indigenous groups is far lower. And so one of the recommendations coming out of that work is that one of the best things that we can do for preserving Amazon forests and the carbon that they absorb and hold is to support the sovereignty and the rights of indigenous groups, which, you know, sometimes we hear about a solution and something that we need to do, and it feels like climate solutions need to involve sacrifice of some sort. And to me, that was just such an amazing thing for the science to come out and say, no, the solution here, part of the solution here is just doing the right thing and supporting the sovereignty of indigenous peoples and their ability to preserve and restore forests.
Yeah, this is an understanding I've come to just over the last year, but certainly I mean, Gary, I don't know what your experience is, but in the UK, there are really not a lot of Brazilian goods on the shelves. I mean, at one time there was some Brazilian wine, occasionally there's Brazilian grapes, but you know, we don't have, I'm not aware that you've got Brazilian labeled beef. I mean, that may be incorporated into other things, but you know, beef here is normally labeled as British or Scottish or, you know, Irish.
Argentinian beef is very.
You've got that in your area, have you? Not round here, Gary.
Around here, do you know what I love, Heather, is your holistic approach to because we Charles and I have got the privilege of speaking to so many people, and they tend to have a solution which is their specialty, whether it be electric cars or whether it be deforestation, or you're looking at this at a really holistic level. Is there any areas that you want to concentrate on more that you're not quite sure about? Because you're for me, this is honestly, you're one of the most holistic scientists I've spoken to that really looks at each part of the solution and looks at that bigger picture, which is what we need.
I guess for me, the way that I look at it, and part of this came out of years as a journalist where I was speaking to public audiences, and there's a thirst and a hunger for what do I do to solve this, right? Because I think we were talking about this a little bit earlier, the recognition of your vulnerability and collectively of our vulnerability that we've gotten from this pandemic. One thing we know from social scientists and psychologists is that a certain level of fear can be motivating, but at a certain point you pass another tipping point. And that fear can become overwhelming and paralyzing if it's not paired with a message of action. And Charles, you showed us that really clear leaflet that you got in the mail that said, this is what we do to do our part in fighting COVID-19. And we haven't gotten that for climate change, in part because it's a really big problem with a lot of different pieces. And I guess I'm a glass half full type of person. Some people go, you know, we need that one silver bullet to solve climate change and we don't have it, therefore it's too much. And I look at that and say, the fact that there's no one overarching right solution doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. It means there's a huge array of things we can do, all of which are right. They're not the whole thing, but each of them is right. So that's restoring forests, that's also planting trees, that's changing our consumer habits. And so for me as a journalist, being in a position where, you know, and also, you know, now from a position within the science community, it's not necessarily my job to tell you, Gary, how to live your life, and you, Charles, how to live your life. But what I see in climate change is an opportunity for all of us to reconnect with our personal values and figure out what is the right, at least first step, maybe it won't be the last step, to take in addressing climate change. So does it have to do with your diet? Does it have to do with transportation or your home? There are so many different ways that climate change intersects with our lives that we have a lot of different opportunities to find the solutions that are right for us. And as you, Gary, and Charles both know, I'm in the midst of moving from one home to another home just across town. In some regards, our new home is not up to where we were in terms of our efforts to get ourselves as a family more resilient off-grid. But in part, the move was motivated by the fact that we're now closer into town. And all three of my children will be able to walk or bike to school, will be able to bike or walk to the grocery store, to the library, to playgrounds. It will be easier for my husband and I to get to work that way, right? So that's a choice that for us felt really right as a family. To be engaging in more active transportation was really important to us. And so I think there are opportunities like that for people to find the piece of the puzzle that's right for them. And then I think another really important thing that we've learned from psychological research is that small successes actually create motivation to do more. So I really push back against the idea that there's any action that is too small to start with when it comes to climate change. No, changing your light bulbs will not solve the problem. But if changing the light bulbs is a first step that gets you thinking about, oh, well, that wasn't so hard, what more could I do? Then I think it's an amazing first place to start.
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head with fear of loss. It doesn't have a longevity of opportunity for gain with motivating people. The cream of motivating human beings is changing the world. So we just need to gamify it. We need to have some kind of checklist, like you said. And I love the way you answered that question. Thank you. Charles.
Yeah, so I mean, Heather, really appreciate the fact you can walk to places in the US. And my experience of the US, you know, walking is a pretty low priority. Where Gary lives, I mean,
this pandemic can change that, because apparently a handful of cities, including Boston, the city closest to me, have been experimenting with closing some streets to allow more pedestrian traffic, more space, so that people can be out and walking and biking while observing social distancing. So maybe one of those silver linings of people getting a taste of what a more pedestrian-friendly transportation system would be like, would feel like.
But where Gary lives, because I normally go to Gary's studio, which is behind him. But where Gary lives, I mean, Gary lives a short walk from a station on the most amazing public transport network probably in the world, which is the London Underground system. So you can in normal times you can travel anywhere very efficiently. by that. But in terms of what people can do, I mean, for me, the really big thing that comes to the top of the pile is really, it's up to people to choose. And so we've got this choice in front of each of us, and the choice is very straightforward, that we carry on as we are. You know, we just carry on as things are. We carry on in the normal way, and the scientists are saying that global warming, we will have 3 to 4 degrees of global warming, which is absolutely massive, catastrophic crisis point, because they say we need to have 2 degrees maximum, and ideally 1.5 degrees. So 3 to 4 degrees is massive, and basically we end up wrecking the planet, the future of our children, our wildlife, and all the rest. Or the choice is actually just to make that choice, really make that commitment to say, look, I want to stop global warming. And it's as simple as that. Once people have really made that fundamental choice, then a whole load of differences roll out of that. So, I mean, Gary, were you going to do a poll at some stage on this? But
yeah, our audience is online. Our audience is here. So let's see. We've got a poll.
That's the fundamentals, and then having made that choice, then there's things that that basically people can do from that. And the first one I would say is really just to be aware of your CO2 emissions. I totally agree with Heather that planting trees is not going to solve it. It's going to buy us time, and it can buy us a lot of time, because you know, trees planted in the tropics really start to absorb CO2 pretty quickly, as I understand it. So the first thing to do is to be aware of it, and then to start to do something about it.
Definitely.
So, Gary.
Yes, our audience are on social media, not necessarily in this room. So that poll, you can answer it for yourselves. You can answer it on social media. That was good, but we didn't quite. The question is, will the action we take today be enough to directly impact the climate change? So 100% have said too little.
Brilliant. Yeah, okay.
Well, if you're talking about the actions we've already taken today, then that definitely is true. But yeah, I mean, certainly there's lots of opportunity, and we are not going to stop. And I think this is also really important for people to realize, and maybe we've learned from this pandemic, we're not going to undo what has already happened and what has already changed in our climate system. And Charles, you mentioned those projected levels of warming and the targets. You know, important to realize that we're already at 1 degree Celsius, or a little over 1 degree Celsius of total average global warming from pre-industrial conditions. So if we're talking about trying to limit it to 1.5, we're 2/3 of the way there already. We've got a lot of work to do in a very short time to try to hit those kinds of goals.
And young people are so passionate about this, and they really want to do something. And it seems that there's a power shift, because the guys in charge, us, don't seem to be acting quick enough. It's really their planet. They're the next ones to have this. So we have a responsibility to our children to make sure that they come into an amazing world that we once enjoyed, and we do enjoy. Now, I often go to schools, I do talks to young people, and I say, do your passion, children. Follow what you really love. And they say, but sir, how will I know what I'm passionate about? And I say, well, time will fly. We only have 9 minutes left to the hour. And I can't, it's felt like 5 minutes. I don't know about you both. If I were to give you a magic wand, Heather, and you could have 3 wishes, environmental wishes, and do you think that you could translate that and just, there's your wand, you can hand that over. What would you wave and ask for?
Oh, wow. I guess the first and biggest would be social justice.
Wow.
Because I think that if we were to give more power to the people who have not had it, that many of the other problems would fall into place. We know that small island developing nations are already seeing sea level rise eat away at their coastlines and at their fresh water. They were the ones at the Paris climate talks in 2015 demanding that the goal be 1.5 degrees limit, not 2 degrees, because they recognized that even 2 was far too dangerous for them. And their voices were heard, and we ended up with that more stringent goal in the Paris Climate Accord. So that's a really big one, and maybe that takes all 3 of my wishes. I don't know.
That has surprised me, but it
that
makes
power shift would be huge. The second is a little bit more nuts and bolts, but it's a major shift in our economic system, and not putting all of the responsibility on consumers to pick and choose, is this Brazilian beef, was this causing deforestation, what is the carbon footprint of this problem, but instead embedding the price of carbon in our economic system. Because the reality is that as much as we talk about the economic trade-offs and what it will cost to address climate change, any money that we spend on climate change, the damages, if we don't take those actions, will cost far, far more. So we're not talking about that economic trade-off in a way that's fair. I think we've seen with this pandemic a realization that, oh, sometimes you have to incur huge costs to avoid even bigger costs in terms of human lives. And that's really what we're talking about with climate change as well. So we need to embed the cost of carbon in our economy.
I really didn't prep you for this question, and you've answered it so logically. You're incredible. And the one last wish.
I get one last wish. Oh, well, I'll throw one of my favorites out there. You know, more active transportation, just because it is, at least for me, it's just such a joy to be outside, moving our bodies, being in the natural environment. I would love for that to be part of everybody's solution to climate change.
Okay, well, Gary, for me, I've shown this little leaflet already. I think that I'd like to see governments across the world translating the emergency into this sort of very simple message and action thing. And to go on the front page, it's got to be reduce your CO2 emissions. It's got to be one of the action points on here. Yeah. So that one for me. Secondly, when Trump decided that he's going to pull America out of the Paris Agreement, people said, oh, well, it's not that a big deal because, half of America, the states like California and New York are sort of staying in the Paris Agreement anyway. But like he's actually done on coronavirus, I mean, I think it's pretty clear he did change his mind on coronavirus, and I would like him to change his mind on climate. And what he actually said, he didn't say he didn't agree that climate change wasn't happening. What he said is that the economics weren't right. It wasn't right, that it was going to cost America too much. And I'd like to see him change his mind on that, because I think that would be really good, or have his mind changed for him, let's put it that way. And then I'm totally with Heather on the point about embedding the cost of carbon into products, because that way people are going to see the difference, they're going to see the impact. And just on that one, in the UK, if you are watching from the UK, then we have this ability here to basically switch and choose your electricity supplier. So if you're with standard, one of the big 6 electricity suppliers, you can actually change to a green electricity supplier. So all your electricity then comes from renewables, and that if enough people do that, that makes a huge difference. So as part of that one, but the embedding the carbon tax or whatever you call it is critically important, because then people are going to see. They're going to see the cost of it. And if you're not aware of it, there is a proposal from Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a worldwide proposal, which is that actually you get a rebate back, so that you don't pay, the average user does not pay the tax. They pay the money out, but they get a rebate, so that at the end of the day, the only people who pay are the big users of carbon, people who use a lot. So those are my 3 points, Gary.
Love that. Heather, on your podcast, you interviewed 800 people. You did a kind of the end one, the last one, you did a snapshot of all your favorite interviews. And I think this will probably be, it definitely will get in the Hall of Fame when we get to 800. You interviewed somebody who does mindfulness, and this question that you asked him, it meant something. You said, well, how has mindfulness changed in the last 25, 30 years? And he said, not really, it's still the same. And I think that people will be talking about the environment and we will still be saying there's the same solutions. But I certainly would like you to come back. I think we should extend the invitation after this coronavirus has come, and then we can look at some data, how things changed. That would be amazing. You have been such a delight to be with, and your presence and your energy and your passion, all of that comes across, and you explain things so well. Charles, I'll let you wrap up. We have 2 minutes left, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. Thank you, Gary, for organising this, and thank you, Gary, for the great idea of let's have another session. I would just say that if anybody's been inspired by this to do something, then do please think about making the choice to stop global warming, first of all. If you are doing that, then start to reduce your CO2 emissions for the reasons that Heather has said. And thirdly, do think about planting some trees. We're all creating a lot of CO2 emissions. We can all do something about it. We can all plant some trees. Personally, I've planted 3,500 trees, which remove 14 tons of CO2 per year. If you're from the US, then you need to plant a few more. You need to plant 4,000 trees on average. And obviously some people need to plant even more. But it's n0co2.org. And all the money goes to planting trees. And that money, most of it goes to people from extreme poverty who plant the trees. So thank you very much.
I'm going to watch this again. I enjoyed it so much. Heather, we should give you the last word before we wrap up.
Well, thank you both so much for having me on the podcast. It's been a real joy.
Great. Everyone have a safe day, and we'll get back to you with more updates. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you. Thank you.